Hey guys, I am DM Zone. This is Gamer's Oasis. Let's get into it. Okay, guys, so we're going to talk about elves real quick. So far, I've done a little over 18 hours counting this video of videos talking about original Dungeons and Dragons. There's a lot of other videos you can go see. I talk a lot about the different races and all that type of stuff and different ways of playing and chainmail and all these other things like Brownstein and that type of stuff. And again, I'm going to get into my conclusion first so that you can have an understanding of what I think about elves without having to watch the rest of this video. But if you want to see how I got to my conclusion, please feel free to stick around and watch until the end. Also, give me a thumbs up and a like if you like this format, or if the quality of the information you're getting is worth that like. Also, if you want, you can put a comment down below to have a conversation, and I'll try and respond to you there. So in conclusion, the elf race is one of the most complicated outside of reincarnation or making something completely scratch, like an aquatic elf, for example. Then most games are even out there current all the way back, right? It's so complicated that most players would choose not to play them, or many players wouldn't choose. I would say that they're as equally powerful, though, as they are slow to level up. You're going to spend a lot of time watching other players leave the table or play other different characters as you slowly level with your multi-class or tri-class character. I believe that this slow leveling, this is fairly specific to elves and half-elves. And if you can stay alive long enough to watch as your fellow players leave and die, to be one of the more valuable characters in the group, as you're very diverse and have lots of unique abilities. That said, I feel like they're the closest thing to a utility build you're going to find in the game, and that utility builds tend to be the most powerful because they are non-typical forms of power that are often not suppressed and requires more thought to obtain that power. In many ways, elves are unique in this game. There are more specific allowances to this race than any of the other races. The elves are still fairly restricted as far as they have two classes. They can be magic user fighters. However, back then there was only three classes starting out. As classes developed, the elves were able to do more things. Some things were never really able to be obtained, like Paladin, for example, which is a human-only class, and these type of things. Since they are multi-class, though, this affects how quickly they level, and they cannot be a single class, and they're restricted on level because they're a demi-human. They're not human. So their cap is 4th level as hero, and which is a fighter, and 8th level warlock, which is a magic user. Now, in supplement 1, which I'll get to in its own video in the future coming up, there's a lot of talk about having level increases, and the magic user portion of an elf can be raised by having a higher intellect, and the fighter side can be raised by having a higher strength. So if you have a higher strength and intelligence, you could be higher level than 4th and 8th level. Now, I'm going to get into this more specifically later on, but elves can also become fighter magic user thieves, making one of the very few triple class, or the tri-class, as I like to say, having their XP divided 3 ways. But even with that, some people say that elven magic works differently. I'm not going to get into my own personal what I do with it. I feel like it's too distracting from a new person trying to get into original Dungeons and Dragons, and adding any new system to the game kind of is a bit distracting, and maybe not a good thing overall for the class itself, because it takes away one thing to add a different thing, and it will change the feel of how the game was meant to be played. If you want to see that, you can kind of witness that with my elf character in my actual play, where I have a little solo game and I talk a lot about the different things the characters do in these type of things. I will someday talk about lyrical magic, which is what I personally use. However, some common standards are, they say that elves are not like magic users because their spells are more like a sorcerer, or that they're not able to use scrolls because they're able to do all these other things that a magic user just cannot do. And let's be honest, most people are never higher than 8th or ninth level anyways. So most of what elves can do is just better than the magic user because they can do that plus wear plate mail. And if it's magical plate mail, they can wear that too while casting magic. I'll get to that in a second though. So there was a big push to try and untolkien the elf a little bit to make it into something more of other mythology. I talked a lot about this in the To Be Halfling video. If you've seen, if you go back and watch that one, it seems that certain parts are literally scrubbed from the book, that the sentences are not complete. The paragraph doesn't flow the way you would think it would. Some of the vocabulary is maybe more negative than one would expect when they're promoting their own game within their game. Because they were probably in a very back and forth type of thought on what they wanted and how many elves or halflings do they want in the game because they were so good in many ways. There were also many things that were well known at the table, and these just didn't make it into the book. There was a limit on how much information they could put in. There was a pressure to get this done. It was being done on a typewriter, which meant that easy editing did not occur. So all these were factors, but I'm going to go over some of these things that complicate the race in a way that makes it difficult to understand. And I'll try and go into a little bit more on each one of these points. The first one I want to go into is more of a decision made by the referee, because I cannot find any answer in the source material. Anyone that says they know kind of points to the same things everyone else is pointing to, but it's about a word choice. The choice of word is adventurer. It's clearly not meant to be used as the Webster's definition of adventure, but it's poorly stated. It's a poor word choice in my opinion. There's a lot better, more defining words that could have been stated, or they could have stated for this purpose adventure means and gone into it. What it's talking about is that an elf can change between a magic user and a fighter at the start of an adventure, basically, or during an adventure once, and they can't change twice. When does that start? Where does that stop? When's the next one come around? It clearly states that it cannot be within the same game, so you can't be making a choice to be one thing and then change to be the other thing within the same game. But I could see where that could be if you were to have time pass quickly. One of the things to take into consideration, though, is that didn't happen in original Dungeons and Dragons. In original Dungeons and Dragons, time was minute to minute real, per se, or day to day real. When you played in this day, it was started on this day. And you didn't continue playing if you played for 3 days in game until 3 days had passed. So if you played on Monday and played for 3 days, you wouldn't go back and play those characters until at least Wednesday or Thursday. And if you did play again, you played different characters doing something else in the same space because you didn't want all this going on at the same time where your character was teleporting around. Time was a very important scale for this game, and that's partly because it was designed initially as a war game. And all these things were kind of happening in like a Brownstein type of game where you would have movements and interactions and relationships formed, and you couldn't have something happened before the relationship did, because that would not make time seem real and make it seem like too fantasy. Personally, to me, an adventure is like this. It's a beginning of an arc. Player decides, you know what, I'm going to be a fighter. You go and do your thing. You're traveling. You get to the town. You rest, or a village, or whatever. You're resting. party gets a new adventure to go check out some abandoned ruins, and they really kind of want a magic user, or they were a magic user, now they really want a fighter because they need that. Well, then you go ahead and make that change, and then that's what you are throughout it. It's kind of like you don't know what the adventure is until it happens, so you kind of are a default. And then if you have time to reset, restart, rehone your skills, you can make that shift. But it's not designed that you're traveling down through a hallway inside a dungeon and you're like, man, we really need a magic user for this next thing. I need you to be a magic user. It's not designed for that. It's not designed for the elf to finally get a suit of magical chainmail, don that, and they'd be like, I'm a magic user from here on out. It's not designed for that either. You got to go rest and reset and all that type of stuff. I think that makes much more sense based upon what they would want, personally. So, speaking about magic armor and being able to cast spells, one of the things that's not clearly stated unless you really look into it is about wearing armor and casting spells. There wasn't arcane and divine spells back in the day, so if you could wear armor and you could cast spells, it's assumed to be that. There certainly is not anything that says you cannot cast spells. What it does say, if you look deep into the elf side, it says, thus they gain the benefit of both classes and may use weaponry and spells. They may use magic armor and still act as a magic user. So technically, if you are a magic user and you're wearing normal plate mail, you have to take that normal plate mail off, or you can't act as a normal magic user. If you have magic armor +1 or plate mail +1, then you could put that magic armor on and then act like a magic user while casting spells or being able to do other magic user stuff like research and creating scrolls and whatever. That is a very Tolkien-based thing, especially if you take into consideration that I believe that a lot of the Tolkien-esque-ness of it dealt a lot with Mithril. And I'm going to get into something that was probably part of the thing that got edited out. So Mithril, according to Tolkien, is spelled M-I-T-H-R-I-L. The way Mithril is spelled by TSR, it's M-I-T-H-R-A-L. And that very small, distinct A for an I kept them out of the lawsuit type of thing. It was probably forced upon them. Mithril is something throughout, but Mithril being used in this way and making armor basically magical was not. That was a Tolkien thing that he basically added qualities to metal to make it magical, really, and was one of the aspects of one of the many lawsuits they faced. So I think they took that aspect out for many times. Later, when you look in like 3rd edition, when you look at mithril chainmail, which is an object you can find, it will clearly say that you're able to cast arcane spells while wearing this armor. That it also counts as a category class lighter because of how lightweight it is. I think that is long after the lawsuits, they were able to find ways to negotiate. And they weren't a brand new fledgling company trying to start off on their own. So I believe there were qualities of metal, dwarven made, elven made, that would be considered mithril. And then you'd be able to cast magic wearing this. And that was what the magical armor was specifically for. Now, I have a low magic world for the most part. You're not going to see many people running around with +1 armor, especially at 1st level. So I just allow my elves to cast magic as long as they're in any suit of armor that's designed to fit them. I don't try and make them dance around between it. I feel like you're having a tough enough time in original Dungeons Dragons as an elf. You're going to be 1st level for a very long time. 4,000 XP or whatever it is. 4,500 XP to be able to get to, was it 1st level or 2nd level mage and 2nd level fighter? It's a long time. The next thing is it jumps into fantasy combat, and it's kind of like a throwaway statement. But that is not clearly a throwaway statement. If you've played Chainmail, if you know that there are not a combat system for original Dungeons Dragons, that there is actually like 5. You have jousting, which I'm just going to completely exclude from this because that's its own little separate thing. Then you have man-to-man. You have what I call mass combat. You have fantasy combat, and then you have the alternative combat system, which you can actually find in the original 3 core rule books. The other 3, the man-to-man, the mass, and the fantasy combat, are all found in Chainmail, which is a separate game made 3 years prior. And in the 3rd edition, where they have the fantasy supplement, the fantasy appendix, whatever you want to call it, it's 15 pages that was added to Chainmail. That frankly caused a lot of distress in the wargaming area and inspiration for a lot of things, and really brought a lot of things around. This was a heavily influenced by Dave Arneson and by Brownstein. Both of those are going to have their own videos out there, at least for Chainmail and Brownstein currently. Later, I'm going to be doing a video specifically talking about Blackmore and Dave Arneson and their contributions to our hobby, and we'll go from there. But if you look on page 34, you will find that there is a specific thing talking about mass combat. And in there, it has that because a troll is a 6 hit dice creature, it requires 6 hits in a round to kill it. If you do 5 and then 4, you don't kill it. You have to do 5 in a round of combat. You have to do 6 in a round of combat. The fact you did 9 over 2 doesn't matter. You have to do 6 in a specific round, unless you're an elf. And then you only have to do 3. Unless you had a magic weapon or you were considered a hero, which is a 4th level character or troop or whatever. Normally it's a character. Then you could do it in just a single hit. This brings into the fact that elves were fey and special and, fairy folk and that type of thing. But they try to take the Tolkien stuff away. This can be further seen in the fantasy combat, which came out about 3 years prior to actual Dungeons & Dragons. 3 years prior to all the Tolkien estate lawsuits and these type of things. These type of things would happen before 4th edition of Chainmail, and there would be some changes and modifications. For example, hobbits and balrogs, whether they had wings or not, would be amended or changed, and this type of stuff. So in this, you're seeing a more pure view version, whatever you want to call it, of what Gygax was thinking. In there, he said that elves are different than other races, that they are a fantastic creature because they're fey-like. And if you look, that there's a very specific rule system called fantasy combat in the Chainmail system, where they roll 2d6 and they have to breach that. Now, breach certain numbers or hit certain target numbers on a 2d6 system, adding them together. I talk a lot more about this in the Chainmail rules, and when I'm talking about the fantasy combat system, I have videos on both, so you can go there and check that out. But just know that it's much different than the alternative combat system that was found on page 19 in the core rulebook. So elves are immune to ghoul touch. Later on it's known as paralysis, but in this version of the game it was known as ghoul touch. If you were a longtime player, or if you were playing in Gygax's home games or whatever, or if you've played modern versions of Dungeons & Dragons, you'd be like, yeah, everyone knows that elves are immune to this type of stuff. But you wouldn't know that if original Dungeons & Dragons, the 3 core books, were your only exposure to this type of stuff, and you hadn't read a lot of books and thought, maybe they should be immune to ghoul touch. This is a thing that probably would be foreign to you unless you really got into the rules. And by really getting into the rules, I'm talking about going under the ghoul creature subtype, or looking in the Chainmail rules under the 15-page amendment section, the appendix section of the 3rd edition. And you can see how the creature, it says specifically that elves are immune to the touch of the ghouls. It's not in the elf section. If you look under elves, you're not going to find it. It probably was there, but probably was removed because of selective editing and trying to remove the Tolkien aspects of things. It's not limited to that. There are other things that were removed in like wording or whatever, but were there. It talks a lot about, well, maybe this is my words, specialized training. For whatever reason, elves just do more damage. So an elf using a sword or a bow gets +1. So their damage is 2 to 7 versus 1 to 6 on a d6. They also talked about the fact that there are specialty items like cloaks of elvenkind, boots of elvenkind. And while this might be a nifty green cloak that allows you to basically turn invisible, like it says in chainmail, or they may not specifically have split move, as they say, which split move is one of like the most mobile things. It might not be under the actual elf section. When you read, you will find these things in there, giving the elves the mobility and the ability to hide. And they've made magic items that detail this in greater description, shall we say. But in interest to avoid looking so close to Tolkien, they have removed those things from the elf section. This is again where they're scrubbing part of this away, and probably a cleaner way in not making the class or the race be so bad like they did in Halfling, but it made it very difficult to play the class or the race, shall we say. This is partially corrected in the correction section where it talked about the damage increase and this type of stuff, and you get the +1 to hit when using a bow or a sword and this type of stuff. In the original chainmail version, +1 to hit actually is bonus to damage because it was binary. A hit equals death, or a hit equals like 1 hit dice. So if you needed 6 hit dice, you'd want 6 hits to be able to kill that creature. And that is mass combat. So it's very specific in there. However, if you're to look at the translation between a 2 to 7 damage range or +1 to hit, it really kind of proves itself. They also, in the correction section, talk about halflings, and then very specifically, it talked about the fact that they have a deadly accuracy with slings and thrown items and this type of stuff. Not ranged, but thrown or sling stuff. And of course, if you read the Tolkien stuff, that's very prevalent, very relevant, and all over the place. However, in chainmail, it's kind of a ridiculous bonus. +3 to hit on a 2d6 system is far greater than +3 on a 1 to 20. So if you're doing the fantasy combat system, or if you're doing mass combat on a d6, which would probably be a +1 with that, frankly, or if you're doing the jousting, or if you're doing the man-to-man combat and you have a +3 to hit, that is far superior when plate mail is like a 12. The amount of times you hit with that is far greater. And then you get the additional bonuses of a higher dexterity. Now, higher dexterity doesn't do the same thing in chainmail as it does in D&D, but considering you're now doing both of these in original Dungeons Dragons, the +3 to hit actually means you're getting more to hit in original Dungeons Dragons than you would in chainmail, which again is kind of crazy and kind of shows that dilation or difference between mass combat and scale it down into individual combat, trying to use similar or the same rules, and you really have to define that well. So another thing that makes elves specific is in the supplement 1, it talked about the fact if you have a higher intelligence and a higher strength, or a higher strength, and or you could be higher in magic users and or fighters. This is not true for dwarf. Very specifically for dwarf, it states that if you are a fighter, you get this bonus. However, if you're not, if you're a fighter thief, you do not get this higher level bonus. I don't know what they had against it. but apparently it was pretty important and they didn't want it. They didn't even give this opportunity for halflings, so the elves got the best of this for sure. Part of the reason why I feel like this is a thing that happened is elves were designed from the very beginning to be multi-class. They were the only ones that could be multi-class. Other could change their class, but they would never be considered multi-class. And frankly, the only ones that really could do it in the beginning were humans. Demi-humans could not multi-class because dwarves couldn't be magic users, and elves were both. And halflings could not be magic users or clerics. But I think from the very beginning, they anticipated other classes to be added, other races to be added, that they would be making some changes. And this was part of the progression of the game as they saw it moving forward, even from the very, very, very beginning. So in book 1, it has a section called Changing Classes, where it very clearly says that elves cannot be clerics, and where it very clearly says that you cannot be both a cleric and a magic user, and that this does not apply to elves. So when you go look at supplement 1, you would expect that to confirm that, right? No, actually it doesn't confirm that at all. What it says is that you can be both a cleric and a magic user as well as a fighter and become a first 3 class, and that you do not swap the magic user for the cleric section. And that's another very specific thing for elves specifically. Otherwise, you can't be a fighter or a magic user cleric, even still. You could be a fighter magic user thief, but I really didn't see anything that said you could be a thief cleric in any way, shape, or form. But I feel like that could be in the game and wouldn't be a big hindrance. I probably would trade out the magic user side and have a fighter, cleric, thief for an elf. If you're going to go, I probably would not allow a 4 class class race in the game. I feel like that would be too much. Again, like other things, when you reach your cap, you still continue to put XP into that. So if your cap for fighter is 4th level and you continue on, then you will continue to put XP into fighter and not be able to use that. So a 3 class, or a tri class as I call it, really has that limitations. For a thief though, it says specifically, and I'll get more into this when I talk about thieves after I do a video that talks specifically about original Dungeons Dragons, the 3 core books. Like we're going to call that like a 101 type of thing, like a college level course type of thing. It says though in that supplement 1 book that the thieves can use leathers when they are being a thief. So when you're being a thief and you apparently give up your ability to cast spells and to use all things that fighters can use, which basically the difference between a thief and a fighter back then was armor. You have to be wearing leathers. Then you get your thief skills, which really I feel like this whole thing could become a lot more homogenous, and because you're leveling so slow, and you should still be able to be a thief with the ability to cast magic. That to me just makes a lot more sense. Instead of having a class level terribly slow in 3 different things. They can still wear heavy armor, but they don't get their thief abilities. So they can still be a fighter, or with magic armor in my game, they could be a magic user in plate mail. Or if they had, or frankly, they would have the ability to cast magic regardless of what armor. But they couldn't be a thief unless they're in light armor or no armor. This is also probably because it's some of the impressive things they do as a thief is a form of magical ability. I won't get into this again, but it's not just the ability to climb a wall. It's the ability to climb a sheer surface. It's the ability to hear things far better than any race can by itself, just because you're a thief, and that type of stuff. I would say that Greyhawk was one of the most important supplements that come out in original Dungeons and Dragons. It did have a very altering effect on the game. I think that'd be a clear understatement to say that. But when I get to that book specifically and I talk more about it, I think you will see what I'm talking about. In there, it actually describes elves more. In the original book, it didn't go into any descriptions about elves really at all. When you get to Supplement 1, it finally gets into the fact that there are wood elves and meadow elves, and that they were actually fairies, that they were fey creatures. It also talks about the fact that elves and half-elves exist, and that I'll be talking about that in a different video in the future. The half-breeds were more of a thing that Artisan did with Supplement 2 in Blackmore. And in that one, he actually included aquatic elves as a creature, not as a race that can be played. However, as we all know, anything can be turned into a playable race. When I do my original Dungeons Dragon video, I will talk about the fact that the game was more broad than what the core rules were wrote, and it was expected that you were to go in there and to make changes to the game. It's just, I think, really good to have a foundational understanding of the game before you do that. Continuing on with special abilities of elves. Elves could find secret doors on a 1 in 4 chance, which is normally done on a d6. Things like dwarves and halflings could find it on 1 or 2, but on a d6, which I think is not quite as good. Yeah, it's 2 numbers, but a 1 in 4 chance is more likely to get it. So yeah, the rules were pretty nice for an elf. Also, it states that on a 1 or 2, if they're just close to the door, they're actually able to know that the door is there without being able to maybe find it. Personally, I could see a person just combining that into a 3 in 6 chance of being able to spot the door instead of having 2 different rolls and different dice. I like the singular roll of that. They do get the demi-human ability to hear noise, so a 1 in 2 on a d6 versus a human 1 in 6. They also have 60-foot infravision. Dwarves and elves both have infravision. Halflings and humans do not. All monster races, while there are monsters, are considered to have infravision. Again, we'll get into that later. So in conclusion, the elf race is one of the most complicated outside of reincarnation or making something completely scratch, like an aquatic elf, for example, than most games are even out there current all the way back, right? It's so complicated that most players would choose not to play them, or many players wouldn't choose. I would say that it's equally powerful, though, as they are slow to level up. You're going to spend a lot of time watching other players leave the table or play other different characters as you slowly level with your multi-class or tri-class character. I believe that this slow leveling, this is fairly specific to elves and half-elves. And if you can stay alive long enough to watch as your fellow players leave and die, to be one of the more valuable characters in the group, as you're very diverse and have lots of unique abilities. That said, I feel like they're the closest thing to a utility build you're going to find in the game, and that utility builds tend to be the most powerful because they are non-typical forms of power that are often not suppressed and requires more thought to obtain that power. Though less is said about the race and other things like the hobbits and balrogs, I believe that elves were heavily edited to avoid the process of lawsuits. I say this because green-cloaked elves having stealth or magic items being named after them because they're so good at it, or being completely or next to invisible, as is said in Chainmail, having superior skills with bows and swords, and having the most mobility in the game, a split move, is near Jedi-like powers to detect secret doors. They probably had some space they needed to create from other intellectual properties out there, as they were very close in many ways to that. Anyways, guys, if you want to see more videos like this, let me know in the comments down below. Sorry this video went a little long. It's a lengthy one, for sure. I will do better to narrow it down. Maybe not in the original Dungeons Dragons one, because that's still going to be probably a long one, but I will try and narrow it down some as we go into other topics. Anyways, guys, hope you guys like this one. See you next one. Catch you guys later. Keep rolling those dice. Bye.